In 1863, Montana Territory was a place where gold moved faster than law. Towns appeared in weeks. Rules lagged behind. And every ounce of dust pulled from icy water had to travel the same way, out of the gulches, into an assay office, then into a strongbox onto a stagecoach. That stage line between Virginia City and Bannack wasn't just a route, it was an artery. Virginia City had exploded after Alder Gulch. Bannack had been the earlier capital and the first big-name miners trusted. Between them stretched a brutal 80 miles of narrow grades, river cuts, and choke points where a wagon could be stopped by a fallen tree or a single man with a rifle. People learned to live with danger, but in the fall of 1863, danger stopped looking random. Stagecoaches were being hit with precision. Drivers were killed. Guards were stripped of their weapons. The thieves didn't waste time searching baggage. They went straight for the gold like they already knew exactly where it was and how much was inside. And then one shipment vanished that forced everyone to admit the truth. This wasn't just bandits. A coach left Virginia City with a major consignment of gold dust and small bags sealed for transfer. Accounts differ on the exact amount, but the numbers spoken in the streets were enormous. Enough to buy buildings, enough to hire men, enough to start a war in a territory where men already carried guns like they carried breath. The coach never reached Bannack. Later, the scene was found near a narrow stretch of road, bodies, broken wood, empty harness lines. The horses were gone. The strongbox was gone. And whatever that gold was worth, it had evaporated into the hills in a matter of minutes. If you're here for real stories, real gold, real places, real decisions that left treasure untouched, then stay with this one. Because the most unsettling part isn't that the shipment disappeared. It's that someone may have known it would. Gold in Montana didn't sit still. Miners didn't have vaults. They had poke sacks, tin cans, and trust in assayers, banks, and express agents who weighed gold dust down to fractions and stamped paper receipts that meant everything. From there, gold moved through a simple system: assay office, recorded weight, sealed container, scheduled departure, stagecoach. That system had one fatal flaw: too many people had to know enough for it to function. A valuable shipment wasn't announced like a parade, but schedules were not mysteries. Express companies ran on predictability. The coach had to depart when it departed, or commerce stopped. Guards were hired. Sometimes extra guns were requested. And in a territory full of rumour, the size of a shipment rarely stayed private for long. In the months before the missing consignment, robberies followed a pattern that didn't match desperation. They hit the same kinds of places: steep grades where horses slowed, river crossings where wheels bogged down, narrow passes where a coach couldn't turn around. The attackers worked quickly. They didn't rummage. They didn't argue. They acted like men doing a job they had rehearsed. That's why this one shipment mattered. It vanished in a way that made people look at the system itself. Because if the thieves knew when the coach would leave, if they knew where the strongbox would be placed, if they knew when the guard roster was thin, then someone was feeding them information. And in late 1863, the man responsible for enforcing law across the stretch of territory was Sheriff Henry Plummer, an elected official, well-spoken, outwardly respectable. Plummer represented something Montana desperately wanted to believe in: order. But the territory was about to learn that order can be the most useful disguise. When that big shipment disappeared between Virginia City and Bannack, the question stopped being who robbed the coach. It became something colder. Who made the robbery possible? Because if this was an inside job, if the road agents were a network rather than a few desperate thieves, then that missing gold might not have been spent in town at all. It might have been hidden, buried quickly, somewhere off the road, marked in a way only a few men understood, men who were about to be hunted down before they could ever return. And that is how shipment can vanish without leaving a trail. Not because nobody looked, but because the people who knew where to look didn't survive the winter. After the vanished shipment, fear shifted into calculation. Merchants in Virginia City began comparing dates. Which coaches were hit? Which weren't? Who had been in town the day before departure? Who had quietly disappeared the morning after? What they found wasn't chaos. It was rhythm. Robberies did not occur randomly across the territory. They clustered along the same stretches of road. Certain riders were reported near attack sites more than once. Some men seemed to anticipate departures without ever being formally informed. And most unsettling of all, no large-scale ambush ever occurred when armed escorts were unusually strong. It was as if the attackers knew when protection would be thin. Miners talked in saloons. Teamsters whispered at feed stations. Express agents began to suspect that information was leaking somewhere between the SA office and the sheriff's desk. The territory was small. Trust networks overlapped. Lawmen drank in the same establishments as gamblers. Guards shared poker tables with men who later rode out of town under cover of darkness. The road agents, as they were increasingly called, were not faceless outsiders. They were woven into daily life. By late 1863, the name of Sheriff Henry Plummer was no longer spoken only with respect. It was spoken with hesitation. Plummer had authority over deputies. He had access to movement schedules. He knew which shipments required additional security. He knew which roads were considered dangerous. And he had the power to assign men to patrol or not patrol certain stretches. Whether he was mastermind or merely negligent remains debated by historians. But in that moment, to the people living through it, coincidence felt like conspiracy. And the missing shipment between Virginia City and Bannack became the example everyone pointed to. Because that coach had left under ordinary conditions, not heavily guarded, not secretive, just another run in a long line of departures. Except it wasn't. The gold in its drawn books represented the accumulated output of multiple claims, months of labour, the financial stability of merchants waiting for payment, investors expecting returns. When it vanished, something else vanished with it. Confidence. And once confidence collapses in a gold territory, everything begins to fracture. Fracture turned into action. In December 1863, citizens in Virginia City formed what became known as a vigilance committee, an organized group determined to restore order where formal law appeared compromised. They operated quietly at first. They gathered sworn statements from witnesses who had been too afraid to speak publicly. They cross-referenced stage departures with known movements of suspected road agents. They traced sudden increases in spending by men without visible sources of income. The pattern sharpened. Certain individuals were present in town before nearly every robbery. The same names surfaced repeatedly. Some were deputies. Some were former miners turned opportunists. Some were simply men who seemed to know too much. The committee acted decisively. Arrests were made without waiting for territorial courts. Accused road agents were interrogated. Confessions, some coerced, some volunteered, began to describe an organised structure. According to testimony preserved in later accounts, signals were used to communicate shipment sizes. A raised glass, a coded phrase, a particular rider leaving town at dusk. The network allegedly extended beyond isolated bandits. It functioned like an intelligence system, and at its supposed centre stood Henry Plummer. In January 1864, Plummer was arrested. There was no lengthy trial in the modern sense. The Vigilance Committee moved swiftly, arguing that conventional justice had already failed. Within days, Plummer and several alleged associates were hanged. The executions shocked the territory. Some called it necessary. Others called it mob rule. But here is the detail that matters most to our story. When the hangings ended, the robberies largely stopped. The road grew quieter. Commerce resumed, which seems to confirm that the network had been real. But something else happened too. The men who might have known where the largest stolen shipment had gone were suddenly dead. If that missing gold between Virginia City and Bannack had been divided and spent quickly, it would have surfaced in circulation. Yet no sudden flood of large gold dust payments appeared in the records, which raises a harder possibility: that the shipment was never fully distributed, that it was hidden, and that winter came too fast for anyone to safely retrieve it. Because Montana winters do not negotiate. They bury roads, they erase tracks, and sometimes they preserve secrets far better than any vault. By the time the executions were over, winter had already taken hold of the territory. Snow did not fall gently in the mountains between Virginia City and Bannack. It accumulated in drifts that swallowed wagon ruts and erased footprints within hours. Wind carved the ridgelands clean and filled the ravines deep enough to bury a horse. If the stolen shipment had been moved far from the road, winter would have made recovery nearly impossible. But if it had been hidden quickly just far enough from the main route to avoid discovery, then the timing of the arrest changed everything. Imagine the sequence: a successful ambush, the stromwooks removed, the horses led away to avoid identification, the gold too heavy to carry in haste over long distance, a temporary concealment chosen behind rock outcrops, beneath loose earth, near a bend in the trail only insiders would recognise. The intention may never have been to abandon it permanently. It may have been staged for retrieval once the search cooled. But the search never cooled. The Vigilance Committee did not dismantle quietly. They pressed, they questioned, they hanged. And if even one of the men who knew the exact location died without speaking, the chain of knowledge snapped. In mining territories, gold was rarely lost by accident. It was lost by interruption. The interruption that winter was absolute. Executions removed leadership. Associates fled. Suspected sympathizers disappeared into other territories. Some left under suspicion. Some left out of fear. Some left because they knew the hills too well to stay. And the road between the two boomtowns fell silent. No documented recovery of that specific shipment ever entered official record. No detailed ledger showed its redistribution. No bank statement reflected a sudden surge matching its value, which left behind something more unsettling than theft: silence. Because when gold is spent, it leaves a trail. When it is buried, it leaves only absence. The missing shipment did not belong to a single magnate or distant corporation. It belonged to dozens, small claim holders, partners who split creek beds into sections, merchants who advanced supplies on credit, investors back east who had wired funds into a territory they would never see. Each ounce represented labour measured in freezing hours, broken tools, and collapsed shafts. When the coach failed to arrive, the losses rippled outward. Some miners lost operating capital for the next season. Without shipment revenue, they could not purchase timber, powder, or equipment. Claims went idle. Merchants who had extended credit found themselves exposed. Gold that was meant to settle accounts never appeared. Prices rose. Trust tightened. Even the express companies suffered. Confidence in stage transport dipped. For a brief period, individuals attempted to move gold personally, creating smaller, more vulnerable targets across the territory. The disappearance affected more than balance sheets. It destabilized momentum. Gold rush economies are fragile. They rely on continuous movement of people, of supplies, of metal. Interrupt that flow, and boomtowns can contract as quickly as they expanded. Virginia City survived. Bannack survived for a while. But something shifted after that winter. The illusion that gold was simply a matter of effort dissolved. Men began to understand that extraction was only half the equation. Delivery was the other half. and delivery depended on trust in systems that could collapse overnight. The irony is stark. If Sheriff Plummer and the alleged network were responsible, the very office designed to protect shipments enabled their loss. If the Vigilance Committee acted justly, their speed may have ensured the gold would never be found. Either way, the shipment did not return to circulation. It did not rebuild claims. It did not stabilize trade. It simply disappeared between two towns that once believed gold moved in only one direction forward. And that brings us to the core question of this story. Was the shipment exhausted or abandoned? Because those are not the same thing. Exhausted gold is spent, melted, recirculated. Abandoned gold waits. And waiting gold does not decay. It remains exactly where it was left. To decide whether the vanished shipment was exhausted or abandoned, we have to look at behaviour patterns. Stolen gold in mining territories usually followed one of three paths. 1. Immediate division and spending in small increments. 2. Transfer out of territory through secondary routes. 3. Temporary burial until attention faded. The first option leaves traces. Sudden spending attracts notice. Even in rough camps, large gold transactions were visible. Dust had to be weighed. Nuggets had to be assayed. You couldn't casually introduce tens of thousands of dollars worth of gold without someone asking questions. The second option required coordination. Moving a large shipment quietly out of Montana territory would have required trusted couriers and time, two things in short supply once the Vigilance Committee began acting. That leaves the third option. Temporary burial. In 1863, the road between Virginia City and Bannack ran to terrain perfectly suited for concealment. Granite outcroppings, dry creek beds, soft ground near timber lines. Markers that would look natural to anyone else, but deliberate to the men who placed them. If the shipment was heavy, and accounts suggest it would have been impractical to carry it far on foot immediately after an ambush, speed was essential. Concealment would have been logical. The burial creates a dependency. Someone has to return, and return requires survival. When the Vigilance Committee executed alleged members of the Plummer network in January 1864, they may have removed the only individuals who knew precise cache locations. Associates, who might have known partial details, fled quickly. The territory was no longer safe for them, which means a temporary hiding place could have become permanent by accident. Gold does not signal its presence. It does not rust or decay into visibility. Once placed underground, it becomes indistinguishable from the earth above it unless someone knows exactly where to dig. The distinction matters. If the gold was exhausted, it reshaped the territory quietly and invisibly. If it was abandoned, it still exists. And some were along that 8-mile stretch, beneath soil that has frozen and thawed more than 150 times. As strong books or fragments of one could remain. By the spring of 1864, the violence had subsided. Stagecoaches resumed predictable schedules. Merchants reopened lines of credit. The Vigilance Committee gradually dissolved its emergency structure, having declared its mission complete, and Montana Territory stabilized at least on the surface. Virginia City remained active for years. Bannack slowly declined as richer strikes drew miners elsewhere. New camps formed. New rushes ignited. The map of gold shifted, as it always does, but the missing shipment faded into rumour. There were no official recovery notices. No documented claims of rediscovered treasure tied conclusively to that specific ambush. No confirmed ledger entry showing its return to original owners. Over time, the event blurred into the broader legend of the road agents, and that blurring created a problem for historians. The more dramatic the story became, the harder it was to separate fact from embellishment. Some accounts inflated numbers, others minimised involvement. Plummer himself became a polarizing figure, either mastermind of a criminal empire or scapegoat in a territory desperate for order. But remove the mythology, and one fact remains stable. A documented shipment left Virginia City. It did not arrive in Bannack. Its value was never formally reconciled. That is not folklore. That is an unresolved loss inside a documented economic system. And economic systems do not forget numbers easily. If that gold had re-entered circulation in a measurable way, someone would have recorded it. Instead, the books close with absence, which means that somewhere between Boomtown and Capital, the road absorbed more than blood and broken wood. It absorbed value. And value, once buried, does not announce itself. If the gold was buried, why didn't someone return for it later? At first glance, that question seems simple. Greed usually outlives fear, but the winter of 1863-1864 changed the structure of power in Montana Territory. The executions carried out by the Vigilance Committee did more than eliminate suspects. They sent a message. Anyone even loosely associated with the road agents understood that staying in the region meant risk. Some fled west. Some disappeared into Idaho. Others likely changed names and moved on before suspicion could tighten around them. Returning to a known ambush site would not have been subtle. Stage routes were watched more carefully after the crackdown. Travel patterns were noticed. Strangers were questioned. Even former associates would have faced a problem of trust. If only one or two men knew the exact cache location, cooperation became dangerous. Each participant would fear betrayal. Each would calculate whether the other might speak first. And then there was the physical landscape. Mountain roads shift over decades. Floods reshape creek beds. Trees fall and rot. Snowpack alters soil layers. What was once an obvious landmark, a split boulder, a crooked pine, a distinctive ridge can vanish within years. Without precise measurements, even someone who had buried the gold might struggle to relocate it after a long absence. Time erodes memory as effectively as weather erodes rock. If the gold was hidden in haste, marked quickly, and intended for recovery within weeks, not years, then delay alone could have doomed it. The men who buried it may have assumed they would return before the first heavy snowfall. Instead, some were arrested within days. Others were executed within weeks. And by spring, the social structures that allowed coordinated recovery no longer existed. Gold waits patiently. Men do not. Today, the distance between Virginia City and Bannack can be travelled in under 2 hours by car. Back then, it was an exposed lifeline to volatile terrain. Modern visitors see open sky, rolling hills, preserved wooden structures, but beneath that landscape lies the unrecorded possibility of interruption. Treasure stories often focus on dramatic discoveries, shipwrecks raised from ocean floors, vaults opened after centuries. This one is different. There is no map, no coded journal discovered in an attic, no confirmed metal detector strike tied to that specific consignment. What exists is a documented departure and a documented failure of arrival. Some historians argue the gold was divided quickly and absorbed into local circulation in small amounts to avoid detection. That remains plausible. But even if only a portion was buried temporarily, even if only part of the shipment never made it back into trade, that fragment would still represent one of the quietest unresolved losses of the Montana gold rush. Unlike treasure deliberately hidden for heirs, this would have been gold hidden for convenience, never meant to stay underground. Abandonment is rarely intentional at the beginning. It becomes permanent through interruption, and interruption defined that winter. The strongbox, if it survived intact, may have rotted away. Wood collapses, iron rusts, canvas dissolves. Gold does not. If it remains, it lies inert, unchanged, sealed by soil that remembers nothing of the men who placed it there. Between two boomtowns that once pulsed with ambition, a shipment vanished. Not in legend, not in myth, In record, Sheriff Henry Plummer was executed. Alleged road agents were hanged. The violence stopped. The territory stabilised. But stabilisation does not equal resolution. The gold that left Virginia City that day was never formally reconciled in Bannack. No recovery notice closed the ledger. No documented redistribution explained its return, which leaves us with two possibilities. It was exhausted, spent carefully, diluted into circulation, its origin obscured forever. Or it was abandoned, buried in haste, its guardians removed before retrieval, left beneath a road that outlived them all. One outcome changes history invisibly, the other leaves history incomplete. Montana territory moved on. New strikes were found. New towns rose and fell. Bannack eventually became a ghost town. Virginia City survived as a preserved reminder of boom and volatility, but somewhere along that old stage route, beneath soil layered by more than a century of seasons, there may still be a silent remainder of 1863. Not a pirate horde, not a fantasy cache, just a shipment that never arrived. So here is the final question. Do you think the gold was truly spent and scattered? Or is there still a stretch of Montana earth holding a strongbooks no one ever came back for? Because in gold history, the difference between exhausted and abandoned is everything.